The Shadows of Abbor House. This is my true life story. Ladies, please be careful out there. When I met Mike, he was the kind of man that made my mother thank God in her prayers. Successful, charming, and respectful, he carried himself with a grace that was rare in men of his status. He had inherited his wealth from his father, a renowned businessman who owned vast lands across the country. Mike often told me that he had made his own way in the world, but he kept close to the traditions of his ancestors. At the time, I thought that simply meant he valued family, that he respected his roots. I had no idea what those roots truly held. We met at a friend's wedding in Lagos. He was a guest of the groom, and I was the maid of honor. From the moment he walked in, his presence dominated the room. Tall, dark, with an air of authority, he drew people to him like a magnet. When he asked for my number that evening, I hesitated only for a moment. He had this way of making you feel like the most important person in the room, like everything else faded when he was looking at you. It felt intoxicating. Within a few months, we were inseparable. He introduced me to his friends, took me on trips to Abuja and Obudu Cattle Ranch in Cross River State, and when he proposed, it was in front of my entire family during my father's 60th birthday party. He bent down on one knee, holding a diamond ring that sparkled brighter than the Lagos skyline. I said yes, of course. Everyone was thrilled, and my mother couldn't stop singing his praises. She told me I had found a good man, that God had truly blessed our union. We got married a few months later, in a lavish ceremony at a beachside resort in Lagos. It was everything I had ever dreamed of. But the real change came after the wedding, when he insisted that we move to his family estate in Ogun State. He called it Abbor House, a grand old mansion that had stood for over a century, hidden away in the dense forest just outside the town. He said it was tradition that every first son in his family lived there after marriage. At first, I resisted. I was a city girl through and through, and the thought of living away from the hustle and bustle of Lagos made me uneasy. But he was persuasive, reminding me that the city was just a few hours away and that he would make sure I had everything I needed. So, I gave in, convinced myself that it would be a peaceful life, a fresh start. The estate was impressive, I had to admit. Abbor House was a towering colonial structure, built with red brick and framed by trees that seemed ancient. But it was also eerie. The first time I stepped inside, a chill crept down my spine, as if the air itself was thicker with age, with secrets. Mike showed me around, pointing out rooms filled with old furniture, portraits of his ancestors lining the walls. This place has been in my family for generations, he said proudly, gesturing to a large portrait of a stern-looking man. That's my great-great-grandfather, Abbor. He was known for his connection to the spiritual world. I laughed nervously, brushing off the uneasy feeling that seemed to follow me around the house. But the unease grew with each passing day. At night, I would hear whispers, like hushed conversations coming from the corners of the house, but whenever I turned on the light, there was nothing. Mike dismissed it, saying it was just the old house settling, that I would get used to it. The month we moved there was like a mini honeymoon for us. We made love like rabbits in heat, and soon I was pregnant, but I lost the pregnancy in my first trimester. I ugly cried. It was so painful, but Mike consoled me and didn't think it was such a big deal. We could make more babies, his words. But that was not the last time I'd lose a pregnancy. It happened a second time and a third time, and I was frustrated. But all this never seemed to bother Mike. Instead, he seemed to grow richer and richer. He wasn't even perturbed that it was almost a year of marriage and we hadn't had kids. I thought he was being a good husband by not disturbing me, but little did I know. Then he started spending more time in the basement, a place he had told me was off limits. He said it was where he kept his family's artifacts, things that needed to be preserved. He was vague about it, and at the time, I trusted him. But sometimes, I would catch a glimpse of strange symbols carved into wooden masks and dusty old books that looked like they belonged in a museum. When I asked about them, he would change the subject, giving me a reassuring smile that never quite reached his eyes. The real terror began one night, a year and 6 months after we moved in. I woke up to find Mike standing by the bed, watching me with a look I had never seen before, cold, calculating. His face was partly shadowed by the dim lights from the hallway, and for a moment, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. "Mike, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, just turned and walked out of the room, disappearing into the darkness. My heart pounded as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, but eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into sleep. The next morning, he was back to his charming self, acting like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That evening, when he went to the basement, I decided to follow him. I waited until he was out of sight, then crept down the stairs, careful to keep my footsteps light. The basement door was ajar, and through the crack, I could see Mike standing over a wooden altar, surrounded by candles and strange markings drawn on the floor with white chalk. My breath caught in my throat when I saw what he was holding, a small clay pot, decorated with cowrie shells and red cloth. It was an ancient vessel used in traditional rituals, a conduit for spiritual energy. He began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, his voice low and rhythmic. I leaned closer, straining to hear, when suddenly, he stopped and turned, his eyes locking onto mine through the gap in the door. "Amoka," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "I told you never to come down here." I backed away, my heart racing. "Mike, what is all this? What are you doing?" He stepped closer, his expression darkening. "It's none of your concern. Go back upstairs." But I couldn't move. Fear rooted me to the spot as I realized that the man I had married was a stranger, that he had been hiding a darkness from me all this time. He grabbed my arm, his grip like iron, and dragged me back upstairs, shoving me into our bedroom. "Stay out of my business, Amoka," he warned, his voice like ice. "Or you'll regret it." That night, I lay in bed, my mind racing with fear. I knew I had to leave, but Mike was always watching, always lurking just out of sight. I couldn't risk trying to escape during the day, he would catch me before I even made it to the edge of the estate. So, I waited, pretending to sleep while he conducted his nightly rituals in the basement. I needed to understand what he was doing, what his plans were. The next day, while he was out meeting with some of his business associates, I snuck into the basement. My hands trembled as I rifled through the books and scrolls he kept there, my eyes scanning the strange symbols and diagrams. I found a journal, written in Mike's handwriting, filled with notes about ancient rituals and sacrifices involving loved ones and our unborn kids, using them to trap their souls, to harness their life force. My blood ran cold when I found a page dedicated to me. My name was written over and over, surrounded by symbols I didn't understand, alongside dates and notes about my habits, my schedule. He had been planning to use me, to bind me to that clay vessel, to trap my spirit in some kind of twisted ritual. I put the journal back and ran upstairs, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly tripped over the steps. I knew I had to act fast, before Mike came back. I packed a small bag, taking only the essentials, some money, my phone, a few clothes, and hid it under the bed. That night, I waited until I heard him chanting again, his voice drifting up through the floorboards. With my heart pounding in my chest, I tiptoed downstairs and slipped out through the back door. I ran as fast as I could through the dark forest surrounding the mansion. I called my brother from a small motel, my hands still shaking as I told him everything. He came for me the next morning, and together, we went to the police. They took my statement, but when they went to Abbor house, it was empty. Mike had vanished, taking the arm and everything else with him. For months, I lived in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified that he would find me. But eventually, the nightmares began to fade, and I started to rebuild my life. I moved back to Lagos, staying with my brother until I found a place of my own. I cut my hair, changed my phone number, and tried to forget the shadows of Abbor house. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up with the memory of his voice echoing in my ears, the low chant that still sends chills down my spine. I know he's still out there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows. And I know that he hasn't forgotten me. But I am not the same woman who lived in that house, who once believed that love was enough to hide the darkness in someone's soul. I have learned to trust my instincts, to listen to the fear that warns me of danger. And I know that if Mike ever comes back for me,